listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good. I've been busy. I've been putting together a blog on ransomware. So that's kind of, it's obviously such a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a while, but I think it's front page news recently. Normally, I'd just sit down, bust out a blog, and it would be online within 24 or 48 hours. But we've got a review process at our company, and so it'll go through that. But probably looking to publish it, mid-June or something like that, sometime in June. And then what I'd like to do is come back and be a guest on the Identity at the Center podcast, if that would be all right with you.
Well, you have to talk with our booking agent, Mr. Jim Cube. He's the one that will handle all that kind of stuff. I try to stay behind the scenes. I got enough to work on, so maybe I can introduce you to him later and we can get that going. So when you talk about the review process, would it be fair to say that your blog on ransomware might be ransomed?
Be a help for ransom. It could be. I'm kind of wondering if anybody who reviews is actually going to have spent any more time studying ransomware than I have, but we'll see. I mean, it's certainly possible. It's kind of like become my niche interest within the identity space lately, especially looking at, the ways, the anatomies of the attack, which often start with lost or stolen credentials, be it by phishing, be it by, the dark web selling, whether it be by social engineering. Getting your hands on those credentials is kind of the entry point. But then it's how to use those credentials to avoid multi-factor authentication. So as you can see, I'm starting to compile this. How's this going to turn into something interesting to read and interesting to discuss? But, it won't get published unless it's interesting. Promise that.
Kind of unlike this podcast where sometimes it's not interesting. We still publish it anyway.
We have to publish every Monday, regardless of if it's interesting or not. So, but usually it is, and that's thanks to our guests. But, the other thing I've got going on is just some random thoughts. Is been getting, emails or reminders about some of the conferences that are actually happening in person. One is the FIDO conference coming up in Seattle, and then Identiverse, which is taking place in a few weeks, June 21 through 23 in Denver. And I was thinking, I would love to go to either one of those conferences. I'm not sure it's on the cards this year. It's just been a really busy time, as you know. But it also got me thinking, okay, Seattle, went to a couple years ago. Denver, I've been to a few times. Those are two of my favorite cities to visit. I thought, what is my favorite city to go to on a business trip? I almost said business vacation. and if you think about my answer, it is kind of business vacation. It's Las Vegas. And the reason is there's just so much to do. And I'm not a heavy gambler. I mean, I've spent my time at the craps table. That's probably one of the games I like the most. I like poker, but it's a very antisocial game. But I just love being there. I just love the energy. And every time I'm packing to go to Vegas, even if it's for work, usually it's for a conference, but even if it's for work, it's like I just get so excited that I'm going to Vegas. I'm going to eat all that food, maybe see a show, and just be, around all that energy and all those lights and everything. But I'll pass it back to you because I'm wondering, what is your favorite city to travel to for work?
Your Las Vegas answer really surprises me. I never would have thought that you would have picked Las Vegas. For whatever reason, and we've traveled quite a bit over the years, right? I mean, it's been basically the Jim and Jeff show for a lot of the work that we've been doing for a few years now. I would agree. I like Las Vegas. I know a lot of people don't. I don't drink really. I don't gamble really. So but it's world-class people watching. Great food, tons of walking, and just kind of stuff to see and do. And if you wanted to, you never have to leave, the inside of wherever you happen to be. So, if you're in Mandalay Bay, for example, you're there for a black hat or something like that, you really never have to leave the promises, and you never actually breathe fresh air for an entire week if you didn't want to. So I think it's really convenient. I don't know if it's my favorite, but I do appreciate how they've built this industry around conferences and making it so easy, and there's so many amenities. I think of places like San Diego, which I just love the weather. But usually when I'm going to San Diego, I'm staying, in on the ocean or somewhere maybe around like Seaport Village and kind of northwest area of the city. So that's maybe tainted a little bit of the view. The most interesting place that I think I would like to go back again, though, is Makati in the Philippines, which is a suburb, kind of the metro area of Manila. I was there for work several years ago, and I had a great time there. The people were so friendly, and I would go back. I mean, it was really interesting, and I enjoy international travel whenever I can. So I think that's probably my favorite so far. I would love to hit other cities though, like Tokyo, or I'd love to hit Australia. That's a bucket list trip. And if I can find a client willing to fly me out there for whatever reason, I would be all over that in a second.
I know we have a lot of listeners in Australia who listen to the podcast, and we kind of, it's hard for me to even call it fan mail, but I guess it's kind of fan mail. People say, hey, big fan of the podcast, and, I'd like to hear more about X, Y, or Z. And, I wanted to send a shout out to one of our listeners, Stephen, kind of protecting his identity here. Stephen R. Had a lot of ideas in terms of things we could talk about, kind of an intro to IAM, a couple other ideas that we're working on, and we'll plan to make show topics over the course of, we're not planning an end for this podcast. So, the more ideas we get, it helps us stretch things out as far as our planning. The other thing I wanted to do, just one more announcement before we kind of move on, is the second annual Identity Security Report is coming from IDSA. That's going to publish in mid-June. I'm sure the best way to find it is either through their website or following IDSA or Julie Smith, who's their executive director, on LinkedIn. They do a really good job of getting that information on LinkedIn. That's where I usually figure out what they've got going on. But look for that report. It was a great report when they published it last year. I'm sure it will be again. So that's something that's going to come in mid-June, and we'll hopefully have some more information about it as it gets closer.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see what's changed over the last year or so, and see what kind of topics they've come up with this year. And yeah, definitely shout out to Stephen R. Again, protecting the innocent here. Came up with a lot of great topics for suggestion and stuff that we'll get into the hopper and start talking about at some point here. And even if it's something that we have already talked about in the past, I don't think there's anything that precludes us from going back and talking about it again. I mean, the identity space changes all the time, right? So what was true, last year may or may not be the same this year. And, this is mostly an opinion and conversational type of program. So the great thing about opinions is that they can change, right? So if my opinion has shifted on something, and I'm happy to say here's why. So, we'll definitely start working through that. For today, though, let's start talking some identity stuff. And I know that we want to talk about CARTA, which is Continuous Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment, which is a Gartner term. It really talks about authentication and how that fits into the identity space, and making sure that people have the right access to the right information and so forth and things. So we're going to talk about CARTA today. Maybe a little bit is about zero trust, and maybe some other authentication things. And you alluded to our guest. He is a repeat performer on the show. His name is Mario Dusaj. He's a senior solutions engineer from Callsign. He was with us way back in episode number 9, where we talked about authentication when we didn't have any clue what even less of a clue, let's say, than we do today around the podcast. So welcome back, Mario.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. Happy to be back here again and talk with you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So episode 9 was a long time ago. We're talking about where we like to visit from a business trip perspective. Do you have a favorite city that you like to hit?
I think I have favorite cities that I love to visit. But if I had to choose one, if you forced me to, I think I would choose Brussels, Belgium. That was that was the first international project, or at least no offense to Canada, but it was the first international project where I had to go overseas for. So it was exciting. The city was incredible. It was beautiful. I had a great time there. People were amazing. So for both personally and professionally, great time. And that Brussels is always going to have a special place in my life. So I'd say Brussels.
Great waffles and great beer.
Yeah, and chocolate's not bad either.
Yeah. Hey, no, I thought you might mention Ecuador. You're one of the few people I know who have gone on a business trip to Ecuador.
I have gone on three business trips down to Quito. And to be honest with you, it was a toss-up between Ecuador and Brussels. 'Cause in Ecuador, I had the opportunity to go and hike and trek up on Cotopaxi as well. So that was also a really cool experience.
I think that's really cool when you're able to take a business trip where you're being paid to be there, all your expenses are covered, and you build like a great life experience from it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just like you said, I mean, it was a business trip, but it was also a little bit of a vacation as well. So once I got everything done, all my work was done, my clients were happy, I was able to go and enjoy myself on the weekend a little bit.
So that Ecuador time frame was probably around the time that we had you on the podcast last. So kind of wondering, what have you been up to? Maybe you can refresh us on how you got into IAM, whether IAM chose you or you chose IAM, and then kind of just talk us through what you've been up to for the last few years.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually found IAM shortly after I graduated college. I was put into an internship program at my first company, and I went from, they did these 6-month stints. And after about a year of 6-month stints, I found my way into security. The company was just rolling out their first identity and access management program internally. Something about it just spoke to me. I loved it. I had a great time with it. And ever since then, I was hooked. So I've been doing identity ever since then. And that was, 2010, 2011, something like that. Yeah, so since then, just been getting better all the time. Continuous improvement.
You ended up at Identitropy, but then after you left Identitropy, where did you go?
Yeah. So after Identitropy, I found an opportunity to kind of continue to improve and learn more with a company called Callsign. That's where I'm at now. Where essentially I'm like you said, Jeff, I'm a solutions architect. So I'm interfacing with customers all the time, talking to them and learning about problems and challenges that they're facing, and finding creative ways to kind of help them through and solve their problems.
So over the last couple of years since we last talked, and now that we've kind of moving through the COVID era, have you seen any changes in the way that some of your customers or other organizations have been looking at their authentication schemes?
Yeah, this whole COVID thing has been really interesting because, prior to this, everyone thought they were digital, but now everyone has been forced to be truly digital. Everything has gone digital, and I think that's been one of the biggest changes where for a while gyms were closed. You couldn't even go to a liquor store and buy any alcohol. You had liquor delivery services as well, so everything was forced to go digital. So that's forced all these companies to now kind of adapt their processes and shoehorn their processes into a digital format. But that's also been sort of the issue too, is that they're trying to take these real life scenarios and just digitize them rather than making it a truly digital experience. So I think that was kind of part of the problem where companies were not really prepared, and then they just kind of migrated to whatever was available in the digital space.
Yeah, I think that we've seen that with almost every aspect of security where people are now more remote, not only working remote, but shopping remote and doing everything remote, quote unquote, on steroids. We had Bala Kumar on last week from Jumio. He talked about identity verification and the importance of that in terms of kind of high trust use cases and connecting with digital services. When we look at something like CARTA, so Jeff kind of mentioned that's our focus for today is this CARTA framework. It stands for Continuous Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment. And you're kind of dealing with that on a regular basis, right? Your area is around intelligent authentication. So very important part of CARTA. Maybe what we could do is just kind of start with a baseline. What is CARTA so people can kind of understand it?
Yeah, so in my own words, if I were to describe this, I'd say that CARTA is a framework that helps move towards sort of modernizing security practices for the current digital landscape. The network has changed, the perimeter has changed. They're not the same as they used to be. We're not, especially now, the workforce is not all in an office sitting physically with their laptops connecting to a network. So it's a way of assessing risk and building and continuing to maintain trust all the time, right? So it's the ability to take in data. Because security now, in my opinion, is really a data kind of game. That's the blood that fuels the veins of security. So it's being able to take this data, harness it, wrangle it, and make intelligent decisions on it, but do that continually, and then adapt whenever you need to, whenever there's something that is kind of risky, right? So that's how I would describe it. What do you guys think?
No, I think that's, I mean, the model, certainly lines up with, I think, where Gartner has gone with it. And it really kind of, it's four components. It's adaptive access, it's the verification of access and the usage of that. And then it's the management of that access. And then how do you discover additional requirements that need to be circulated back into the policy set from an adaptive perspective? So that makes sense to me. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear CARTA is, continuous authentication. And I kind of think of it as just because somebody initially passed the first hurdle for authenticating, in other words, proving I am who I say I am, as you go through that journey of using whatever applications you have, it needs to be able to adapt to the risk. So the hurdle we might put you through to access a lower risk resource might be different than when you're doing something that's more risky. And then at that point, we may need to re-authenticate you or use a stronger form of authentication, or assess the risk of the activity and look at the context. In other words, you're connecting from somewhere you've never connected before, and then take action. Maybe prohibit you from even using that resource. Maybe you have to, you have to fit a lower risk profile. So it's a framework for thinking about it. And with most frameworks, it has to be adaptable. It has to be kind of somewhat of a philosophy on how to approach, your controls and your investments in technology to protect your resources. It's focused on the highest risk resources, and that's where the controls get tougher and tougher.
Yeah, I think context is extremely important. And one other thing that I think kind of gets forgotten as well when you talk about authentication is there's the user part, but then there's also the threat detection as well. So you may authenticate a user, but then there's also the recognizing of threats. So I may log in, not even realizing that there's a malware on my browser or my device that might be caught or picked up by something else that can then adapt that journey because they've recognized the threat, even though I might actually be the right person.
Yeah, we've talked, I started off kind of talking about this ransomware piece, and the ransomware is, it is what it is in terms of the what the software can do. It can encrypt data, it's not really that the ransomware itself is that complicated. It's how do you get into a organization's computer systems to install it and then have the ability to spread, usually laterally. And when you look at the CARTA model, they first start by talking about discover requirements. And so I've been thinking about a framework which starts with what are kind of your access points. So if you have a corporate network, what are the ways that people can get onto that network? It's via the Wi-Fi. It's maybe they plug into the network, or they're connecting via VPN or ZTNA, or who knows what, maybe you have other ways. Then there could be VPN tunnels from trusted third parties. But there's all these ways that folks can get into your network. And, the question is, where are the controls laid around those entry points? And if you don't have full, controls on all the entry points, the systems that are within that network then are exposed where, maybe somebody didn't do a strong authentication, multi-factor authentication. They're on the network. Now they can potentially have access to a server or a resource. And really, if you think about zero trust and CARTA, it's the idea that, taking a kind of a perimeter approach doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. One is, first off, your attackers could be insiders. Second off, being 100% sure that you have a shell around your network that is impenetrable by hackers is you're probably not likely. And then the third is all those resources that sit outside of your network, like cloud applications and things like that. But in terms of ransomware, I think the trend that we see the most is that people are getting on the network and then they're installing it on a company's servers, the applications that they run themselves, or the file servers or whatever, and then they're spreading laterally. So discovery is really about looking at what all those entry points are, looking at all those resources are, and making sure that, one, you have good authentication controls. And, I think this is really what's the best control is multi-factor authentication. So even if you have compromised credentials, you still need to be able to make it over that multi-factor hurdle. Now, I don't think that's a guarantee that couldn't happen, but there's layers of controls too. There's multi-factor, there's device trust, there's things like that. So all those things play in, but it starts with, you kind of have to understand what you're protecting and how people can get to those resources, right? If someone can just park their car and jump on your Wi-Fi without having MFA, potentially they can weasel their way into your network and install some ransomware. So it starts with that discovery.
Yeah, I would agree. You really need a deep understanding of all of your endpoints, your network, but then also the resources that you're protecting, whether it's for your workforce or for your consumers, and sort of have a classification of what these applications or what these resources are, so that you can then start to say what is appropriate. What sort of scrutiny should we take a user through to make sure that one, they are the right person, and that two, they should actually have access to these resources as well. I think you're absolutely right, Jim.
So we've been on a roll the last several weeks talking about zero trust, and that's kind of been the topic du jour, I think, for the identity and infosec space for the last couple of years. And I think there's maybe some confusion between CARTA and zero trust. How do they play together? Do they play together? Are they the same thing? How do you see CARTA and zero trust fitting together, or maybe they do not fit together? How would you explain that, Mario?
No, I think they absolutely, they're separate, but they work together. So to me, zero trust is sort of a architectural principle or architectural design where you minimize privileges, basically assume or default to a deny for an access request until something is absolutely required. So basically, if you want a resource, the default answer is deny. Prove to me that you need it. Very high level. that's zero trust, and that's a great stance to take. And then CARTA is more about the adaptiveness of making decisions, and then being able to harness this data and harness new information as it comes in through a rule set or a policy, and then adapting your decisions. Because I'm sure, just like anybody else, I've made wrong decisions, or I've made one decision, then I've gotten more information and want to change my opinion later on. So the same thing with would apply here too. As you start to learn, then you can adapt. So I think these work together, but they're separate. And I would say that in my view, zero trust is probably part of the CARTA framework.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it too. I see it as a subcomponent of the CARTA model, right? It's the authentication area of it. And, I was sitting here thinking, and one of the things that we get asked a lot is, how do we simplify and explain some of these concepts to people who might not be as familiar with identity and authentication and continuous and adaptive, auth and all this other stuff that we kind of take for granted every day in the IAM space, but maybe others. And I came up with this analogy of what zero trust networking is. And what I want to do is, picture you're a customer and you're visiting a bar or a pub, as it might be called around the world, right? You want to go in and get a drink. You may be standing outside in a line to show your ID, to even get in, to show that you're of age, right? To be able to go through there. And then you sit down at a bar and you look at a drink menu, or you look at what's on display at the taps, right? To say, okay, here's what we have to offer. And then you tell the bartender, here's what I want to drink. Then the bartender serves you your drink. And that to me is very much a very simplistic way of looking at zero trust networking, because you had to basically authenticate at the front door with an ID that says who you are. Then you're shown a list of available resources that you can request, i.e. the different beers on tap or the drink menu. And then you didn't go back behind the bar and get it. The bartender took the ingredients and made the martini, or pulled together, the chilled glass out of the freezer and poured the nice tall Guinness or something like that, right? And this was all stuff that really I see it as part of the zero trust perspective underneath the CARTA framework. And the way I say that is like, okay, that was the authentication portion of CARTA. And then if you want to expand CARTA to include, or let's see, if you want to expand that to include the CARTA components, right? You're still sitting at the bar, you're drinking a drink, and maybe there's a shift manager who's watching for signs of over-serving and handling other risks that might come up, right? Kind of a traffic cop, whatever it may be. They're verifying the usage of product is appropriate. You might have a bouncer in the corner, right, who's watching what you're doing and making sure you're following the rules before they toss you out, preferably through the door and not the window. They're assessing risk, right, and they're constantly evaluating. And I think of movies like Roadhouse, right, where Patrick Swayze is the bouncer du jour, right, and he's always looking for risks throughout the thing and stuff like that. And then you've got this general manager maybe type person who is really responsible for the entire operation, and they're really kind of overseeing it all. They're making sure that their menu of available services, drinks, beers, whatever it may be, are current with whatever is looking for, from a demand perspective. They're establishing rules and other kinds of regulations and all this stuff for kind of everyone to follow. And they're really coming up with, what are the additional requirements that they need to feed back into that constant cycle and that loop of authentication and making sure things are appropriate and making sure, usage is being managed, and then continually improving that. So, that's kind of my hopefully very simplistic but understandable way to kind of see how zero trust plays inside of the CARTA framework. And that is extremely raw. So I'm happy for anyone to poke holes in it.
Well, you're not going to hear me argue with any pub analogy. I love it. I think there's, let me throw the ransomware piece of, so I think when you think about with zero trust and CARTA and everything is trying, it's interesting. I think when we talked about IAM a decade ago, it was like making sure that someone didn't log in and transfer $50,000. that's not the attack that most organizations are being like sideswiped by. There's two types of attacks that are happening now that just blow organizations' doors off, and those are data breaches and ransomware, right? You get in the door and then you have to move laterally. So what I was going to add to your bar analogy is I come in the door, I'm allowed to go to my bar stool, but I'm not allowed to go around from booth to booth and poison people's drinks. A drip poison in people's beers. So there's that aspect of it, which is that micro segmentation. So in other words, I'm going to let you in, I'm going to let you into your resource, and then I'm not going to let you move laterally. Right? I'm going to have controls that are going to stop that. Then the other aspect of all this is, well, what if your bad actor is your bartender and you've never checked his credentials? Right? He's sitting on your network. He bypassed some of what you thought of as your traditional controls. The bouncer never even looked at him. Nobody thought that this guy might be going around dripping poison in people's drinks. So those are so if anybody's willing to go back to a pub after hearing that, I don't know.
Yeah, you brought up a couple of good points there, and I'm leaning back on my long restaurant background of 10 years before I even got really in the identity space. I thought of another thing too. So when you go up to the bar, you might be asked to show your ID again, a multi-factor, because maybe you got past the bouncer, or maybe they weren't scrutinizing it. But at the end of the day, the person who's going to get fined or get in trouble is probably going to be the person serving the drink. So it's incumbent on the bartender or server to check that ID again. And yeah, you bring up a lot of good points, right? What if you are the bartender and you're the problem? There's a lot of different ways that insider threat can manifest itself, right? People put cameras up in the corner to kind of watch the register or the till where money's being exchanged. You're looking at reports and you're taking stock and seeing, okay, we had, 0.5 of Grand Marnier last week, and now we have 0.4, but we sold no Grand Marnier, or it's not an ingredient in another beverage.
But I think that's what people get hung up on is, we're somebody's stealing Grand Marnier, and the thing that kills businesses is the bartender poisoning people, or it's the ransomware. It's like, yes, it might not happen to you this year, but if they get you by a ransom, your choice is either get in the Bitcoin trade or have them erase your servers. And that's why it's just, or they steal all your customer data and throw it on the dark web and start selling it. I mean, the scenarios are so bleak now. And the thing is, so I've been in the security space for over 15 years, and it used to be like when you would bring up ideas like that, oh, doom and gloom, FUD, which just stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. This guy's just trying to scare us into spending money on this cool technology he wants to implement. I don't think anybody thinks that ransomware is like some FUD factor anymore, right? I mean, it's real. It's on the news every week. And then a lot of the ransomware attacks that happen never make it to the news. I mean, we read about one the other week where a company gave up $40 million to get out of a ransomware attack. I mean, that'll pay for a really good IAM program, right? Or a really good security program. I mean, remember when we had Chase Cunningham on the podcast, he talked about how these attacks are now moving downstream because they were finding it harder and harder to penetrate kind of the top tier targets of the past, the FBIs and the banks, right? They just spend so much money on protecting their cyber assets. So the hackers are moving slightly downstream for the corporations that are big corporations, but, really have traditionally underinvested in security and IAM. And so, those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, these big companies, whether they're banks or they're big merchants or big box stores, they are improving their security. So it makes sense that it's more difficult to attack these companies. So let's shift. Let's hit them somewhere else in the stream and get these get other weaker links that are sort of upstream here.
So Mario, what are you seeing, when you're working with clients in terms of, the controls they're putting around authentication or potentially taking CARTA and applying it. Really what I'm getting at here is like enterprise versus consumer use cases. What are you seeing as kind of the difference in approach? I mean, what I'll say is like I see that my clients are more willing to spend money, big money, on consumer use cases.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would say that there's movement on both fronts. There's movement on the workforce, but there's also a lot of movement on consumer, especially on consumer, because there are a lot of products out there, and there's also a lot of users out there. So the risk of exposure is a lot greater. If something happens internally, it's not a big PR issue if something happens inside to the workforce. But if there is an attack that exposes consumer data, that's a huge hit on company's reputation, big hit to the business as well. So that means a lot to these companies, right? So they want to protect that, and they're moving towards really locking down the consumer experience and a consumer kind of facing services, right? So they're investing a lot in that, and where they're investing is, if we think about CARTA, they're investing in tools that can be intelligent. They're investing in tools that can make use of data in real time, that can adapt journeys, that can interface with other systems, and just really be this whole orchestration tool that lets us, or lets them, create good journeys for the users, while really verifying that these people are who they claim to be, and still tightening security, right? So they're locking down their endpoints, they're locking down their applications, while at the same time they're also giving better user experience, because again, reputation is important, and their security is being enhanced as well. So I'd say that's one huge area where I've seen companies invest, especially on the consumer side.
You mentioned intelligence when it comes to authentication, and it leads me to believe that there is an intelligent authentication and maybe a not so intelligent authentication, or a stupid authentication, perhaps. What is the difference from your perspective of what is intelligent authentication versus, I guess, normal authentication, or less than smart, let's put it that way, authentication?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because it could mean something to a lot of different people. To me, it's about being adaptive, based on good information. So standard authentication, if you go back, 10, 15, 20 years, username and password, you get into your system. Well, there's a lot of stolen credentials now, or brute force attacks that people get into accounts, who shouldn't be getting into accounts. So then we've layered in MFA. Now MFA is firing every single time. So these are static experiences, right? They're ones and zero. It's on or off. There's really no gray area. So I think intelligent authentication is kind of in the middle, and it helps manage that gray area where you can adapt a journey. Maybe you just want a username because you can recognize a device, recognize that somebody's coming in from a known network or from a known location. You can recognize their behaviors based on mouse movement or keystroke analytics, things like that. You can just let them in, right? You're making use of good data, and then you're adapting the journey intelligently. Now, if something is to change and maybe not look like this normal for a certain person, maybe the devices change, or now they're logging in from a different location and their behavior is completely different. All right, so now maybe it's a good time to start to use an MFA tool, right? To bring in a multi-factor authentication, whether that's a push notification to a phone or something different. So it's helping to intelligent authentication is helping take in real time this data, and then orchestrate and change the journey, or adapt the journey intelligently.
So I think you talked about a lot of different types of multi-factor authentication. That typing cadence is one where I've seen technology solutions for, and I always wonder, like, how is that meant more for the enterprise use case, or is that something that is a way to move toward a continuous authentication in the business use case without kind of bugging your user too much?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's done passively. So if you can assess and determine that it's like, if I can walk up to you, Jim, I've met you before, I shake your hand, I can say, yeah, that's Jim. I don't need to ask you for your ID. I don't need to ask you for your social security number, right? So a lot of that recognition is happening passively. I look at you, I see the way you walk. It's a matter of trying to do that same thing in the digital world as well. What kind of device are you using? What sort of behaviors are you exhibiting? It's a matter of studying that side of the user interactions to get a high level of recognition without ever having to step them up or ask them extra questions. It's done passively.
I think that's an area we probably have to get somebody on who really knows that area, works for a company that does that, because I think there's some trade-offs between, you almost have to set a slider on, like, how sure do you want to be that it is the person versus, if you get like a 75% level of assurance that that's the person, you can let them in. If you crank the slider up higher, it's going to have more false negatives, right? So
Yeah.
but I think these different forms of adaptive, or there are really multi-factor authentication, or I don't know. I think it's almost a behavioral thing. So maybe it is multi-factor in what you have or what you are. But I think it's, you compare that to something like SMS, and you still see it everywhere, but it's not something that I think is being pushed very much anymore as like a way to do MFA. It's certainly better than nothing. It's ubiquitous. Everybody understands it. When everybody who uses technology understands, like, why they want your cell phone number to send you a PIN to verify it's you. But you see, like, this guidance has kind of gone away from it. I don't think it's like completely deprecated yet, but what are your thoughts on that, especially with SMS?
Yeah, well, first I would say that this sort of analytic is a form of authentication for sure. I mean, it's the inherence factor. So you have your proof of possession, you have your proof of knowledge, and then there's the proof of inherence, which is something that you are. That could be a fingerprint, a face biometric. That could be your behavioral biometric. So this is definitely an MFA. But the use of SMS, I mean, it's been around for a while. It's inherently weak from a lot of different angles. The network itself was never built with a lot of security controls built in, so it's weak at the network level, and it's also weak in that you don't know, even though you send an SMS out somewhere, you put a phone number in, you don't know where that's going, you don't know where that's ending up. You might send it to an iPhone, but maybe that iPhone, the owner of the iPhone's got a Apple Watch, they've got a laptop, and they've got an iPad, and that message is now shown on 6 or 7 devices. So the person that you think is actually getting that SMS might not actually be the right person. So there's, that last mile of getting the identity is lost with an SMS. But people are familiar with it, and they're super easy to implement, and relatively cheap. You can probably send an SMS for a fraction of a penny, per message. So it makes sense for something quick, but it's definitely not the most secure option.
So Mario, you've been super generous with your time. I think we've had a really fun conversation here today. We didn't do this when you're on before, but we started a new tradition on the podcast, which is to ask a non-technology question, something that's totally bizarre. And so we can't. This is actually. I'm going to give Major Jeff full credit on this one here, which is Okay,
Right,
so
I'm the weird one. Right, I get it. Sure.
Yeah, but when they're super weird, I'm going to credit Jeff. So, Mario, we need to know, the world needs to know,
Phil, this is a drum roll.
if you were a potato, how would you like to be cooked?
Oh man, this is why I love you guys, right? You ask the real tough questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, we spent 45 minutes getting to the real meat of the conversation, or the real meat and potatoes of the conversation.
Hey. If I was a potato, I think I would want to be sliced into little planks like a French fry, and then I would want to be beer battered and fried into just these golden hues of perfection that'll be enjoyed by everybody. How about you guys?
You almost made up your own food. So I was just going to say, mine's boring in comparison. I was going to say German pan-fried potatoes.
Oh.
And guys, if you've never had these, go to a German restaurant and get some schnitzel and get the German pan-fried potatoes as a side. Don't do it if you have high cholesterol. However, if you need a cheat meal, that's what I recommend. It's fried goodness.
This is another good question, and yes, I'll take credit for it because I'm the weird one. I have two, and I'm trying to decide which one. The first is going to be a very specific, a Portillo's French fry, which if you're in the Chicago area or you've been to Chicago area, Portillo's is a very famous kind of Chicago institution for Chicago food, hot dogs, burgers. Nothing really fancy, but just everyone in Chicago knows about it. So a Portillo's French fry, when it is properly prepared and seasoned with the correct amount of salt, perfect. And the tie for that one for me would be a hash brown. I love a good crispy kind of mix of crunchy and soft hash browns with some salt and pepper. That's the way I would go for sure.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think I didn't even like a McDonald's hash brown.
I'm thinking something more gourmet, but sure, McDonald's hash brown sounds fine too.
Yeah, that is a good answer. As you were describing that great French fry, I was thinking McDonald's French fries. I think are the best, but I also have the worst French fries, which are Five Guys. I mean, those things are just soggy, oily. Like, how can you have such amazing burgers and such rotten French fries? I don't get it.
Well, they dump them in that bag, and it's not good. I mean, I appreciate the intention, but yeah, it's McDonald's definitely has a world class fry. Again, when you get them fresh, I think that's the problem. And I was thinking McDonald's French fry, but for me, it's a little too inconsistent in the delivery of that French fry service, where I'm going to be looking to go something a little more consistent.
If you ever find yourself in the Detroit area and you want the perfect fry ever made, there's a place called Hopcat, and they used to call their fries crack fries because they were so good and so addictive. But then opioid crisis, and they ended up changing their name. Best fries ever, and amazing burgers, and excellent selection of beers on tap as well.
Huh. So maybe if we have somebody in the Detroit area who listens, maybe they can either confirm or deny Hopcat as a French fry mecca that people maybe should be visiting. Huh?
That's right. Help me out, Detroiters.
All right. Well, I think we've gone a little bit long here, but we had a really good conversation, and hopefully people kind of followed along with where CARTA and Zero Trust kind of fits together, and kind of how those frameworks overall, right, contribute to the overall security posture of identity and the security of an organization. So hopefully that was helpful. Before we close things out this week, I want to pass it around the horn one more time for any kind of final words of wisdom. Mario, why don't you go first?
Nothing else to add. Thank you guys, though. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on again. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to just reiterate and maybe clarify just my point around the importance of discovery when it comes to Zero Trust or CARTA. Starting point is having good inventory of what you're protecting. What are the entry points? If you know what your entry points are, and you know what the research you are protecting, you can start to then say, what are our controls from an access management standpoint, both from, IGA, privilege access, but probably most importantly, it's authentication, multi-factor authentication, making sure that you have all of your bases covered. that you're taking a risk-based approach if you are anywhere less than all your bases covered. But think like the bad guys. They're looking for a way in. They're looking for weaknesses in your defenses, and then they're looking to move laterally and poison other people's drinks. So think about it from all those standpoints. And then the last point, which I've been giving a little thought to lately, is just, assume that someday they are going to get in, they are going to install ransomware, they are going to breach your data. What are you going to do? Don't wait until that emergency happens to figure out how you're going to communicate to people, who you need to get approval from, things like that. Almost treat it like a disaster recovery plan. Hey, we might have a disaster at some point. We need to plan how we're going to deal with that disaster before it happens, because in the moment of disaster, you're not thinking clearly. Do the same thing when it comes to breaches and ransomware. How are you going to react when it does happen? And then if it does happen, think about it from a containment control standpoint. If you can figure out that systems have been compromised, get them off the network, isolate them, pull the plug, get them off the network as quick as possible.
That's all good advice, and it leads me to the old staying in the security business. There's two types of companies: those that have been hacked and those that don't know it yet. So I think it's a matter of not necessarily if, but when something happens, how prepared are you going to be to deal with it, and what's the fallout going to be? Because we've heard this recent company, they paid $40 million for ransomware. They won't be the last. There's a reason, right? This is so successful. So it's all about managing the risk. And at the end of the day, someone's going to look back on that, on their program, if they've been ransomed for whatever number of dollars, and they're going to look back and say, well, should we have spent $1 million, $2 million, $5 million on proper IAM controls? Probably. Hindsight's 2020. And chances are, if they have that kind of budget, they probably spent 5, 10, 20 times that to get out of the ransomware situation. So it's something to consider. And I think people get it, and that's, I think, why like things like FUD that you mentioned, Jim, earlier, fear, uncertainty, doubt. It's known, right? People get it, but we're also becoming desensitized to it. It's happening daily, right? Every week there's something that's been breached, hacked, leaked, ransomed, whatever it may be. And 80% of those breaches come back to an identity of some sort. So that's why it's important to make sure that you have the proper controls in place. So something to consider for the folks who are listening out there. All right, let's go ahead and close it out for this week. Mario, thanks for being on the show again. I'll have a link to Mario in our show notes if you want to connect with him on LinkedIn, as well as a link to his company, Callsign, CALLSIGN.com. You can visit them and learn more about how they fit into this authentication space, which is really cool. And always you can connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn. Keep those comments coming. I hate the word fan mail. I appreciate the suggestions and the feedback. How about that? It definitely is a motivating factor for us to keep going. And we're always looking to make sure that we have content that people find interesting. So there will be that. And then don't forget, you can visit us on the website at identityatthecenter.com and on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we'll go ahead and close it out. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.